Hello everyone, wishing you all a beautiful and peaceful day. Today, we're diving into an emotional story about a woman carrying the weight of her family, her business, and her fading love, all at once, while quietly realizing the man she once relied on may be slowly drifting away before Tet arrives. What happens when responsibility grows heavier, but the heart grows more distant? If you enjoy heartfelt, deeply human stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. The morning light slipped quietly through the cracks of the old wooden door, painting thin golden lines across the small room. Diep crouched down in front of Nee, her rough, work-worn fingers gently combing through the little girl's tangled hair. She gathered it carefully into a ponytail, tightening the band just enough so it would last the day. "Sit here and study, okay?" she said softly. "Put your hat on so you don't get cold. Keep the fire burning, and don't wander off." Her tone wasn't strict. It was steady, familiar, the kind of voice that had repeated these same instructions through countless mornings. In her world, love wasn't loud. It was practical. It was making sure your child stayed warm. Nye nodded obediently, her big eyes following every movement Diep made. When Diep stood and walked toward the door, the little girl's gaze clung to her back like she didn't want to blink and miss her. At the doorway, Diep paused. She turned around and gave Nee a small smile, one she carefully arranged on her face, but it didn't quite reach her tired eyes. Then she stepped outside into the sharp, biting air. The cold greeted her immediately. Frost lingered on the ground. The smell of smoke drifted faintly through the village. Another day had begun. As she walked down the narrow path away from the house, a familiar ache settled in her chest. Not from the cold, but from leaving Nee behind, even if it was only for a few hours. Somewhere across town, James was starting his day too. His phone was probably already ringing, clients demanding answers, numbers needing attention. They were still connected, still partners in business, still sharing decisions. But the emotional distance between them had grown so quietly that neither of them had known when it began. It lingered there, unspoken, like frost that refuses to melt. Diep tightened her jacket and kept walking toward the timber yard. The moment she stepped inside the open yard, the sound of chainsaws cut through the morning air. Workers moved between towering piles of wood chips. The smell of fresh-cut timber mixed with dust and cold wind. 50 tons, 17 truckloads still waiting. Tet was coming fast. "Tuan," she called out, her voice firm but calm. "We need everything cleared before Tet. Push it all out. We're not staying in this yard after that." Tuan nodded and hurried off to relay instructions. Diep stood still for a moment, staring at the stacks of wood. On the surface, she looked composed. Inside, she felt the pressure building. Time was running out. Every deal had to close. Every shipment had to move. The year couldn't end in unfinished business. She pulled out her phone and dialed James, putting him on speaker as she walked. They talked buyers, negotiations, delivery deadlines. She suggested reaching out to Mr. Duke about taking a portion of the remaining stock. James responded with updates of his own, his voice slightly strained but steady. Each word she spoke felt like an attempt to regain control over the chaos. A strong gust of wind swept through the yard, lifting sawdust into the air. It swirled around her before settling on her shoulders like fine white powder, like time itself, drifting down grain by grain. For a second, her mind wandered. Nye, sitting alone with her schoolbooks. James, the man Nye still called Uncle, with so much innocent hope. Now, he existed mostly through short phone calls and business talk. The weight pressing down on Diep wasn't just about money or wood. It was about holding an entire life together without letting it collapse. She wiped dust and sweat from her forehead and looked toward the dull gray horizon. Be stronger, she told herself. Tet was approaching, and she refused to step into the new year carrying regret. That evening, under the dim glow of a single hanging light bulb, Diep sat at the worn wooden table with her notebook open and her phone pressed close to her ear. "I've been thinking," she said to James. "Instead of 3 million dong gift boxes for the workers, what if we do 500,000 in gifts and give 2.5 million in cash?" There was a pause. "It would mean more," she continued. "It's practical. They can use it however they need." James agreed. They began calculating together. 74 workers, 37 million for the gifts, add year-end salaries. Diep carefully wrote down every figure. Her handwriting was neat, controlled, like writing things down made them manageable. As they talked, something small and warm flickered inside her. She imagined the workers receiving the envelopes, their surprised smiles, their relief before Tet. Then another idea came to her. "What if," she said slowly, "we tell them we're extending shifts on the 28th, and then on the 29th, we hand out everything and let them go home early?" James chuckled faintly. "A surprise?" "Yes," she replied. "Don't tell them ahead of time." For a brief moment, she allowed herself to picture it. The cold yard filled with laughter instead of stress. That small spark of joy felt fragile, but real. Still, beneath it, loneliness lingered. James was there, planning, calculating, agreeing. But he wasn't sitting across the table. He wasn't sharing the same room. Tet's pressure hadn't disappeared. But at least this plan would bring happiness to someone, even if her own heart still felt empty. She held the phone just a second longer after the call ended, as if afraid that once she let go, the connection might fade completely. Later, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of radish soup. Diep scooped rice into Nay's bowl and gently placed it in front of her. "Eat before it gets cold." Nay held her spoon, but didn't start eating. Instead, she looked up suddenly, her eyes bright. "Is Uncle James coming to eat with us?" Diep froze. Her chopsticks trembled slightly. "He's busy," she said carefully. "He comes when he's free." Nay's face fell just a little. "I thought Uncle was going to live with us." The words were soft, innocent, but they struck deep. Diep moved closer and stroked Nay's hair. "Eat your meat," she said gently. "It's good for you." Inside, regret swelled. For Nay's quiet longing, for her own loneliness, for the empty chair that should have had James sitting in it, laughing over something small and ordinary. Late afternoon light stretched their shadows long across the floor. 2 figures at the table, and the shape of someone missing between them. Diep watched Nye eat slowly, her chest tightening. She could give her daughter warmth, stability, protection, but she couldn't give her a complete family. "Finish your food," she whispered. "Then we'll take a nap." But in her thoughts, James lingered, a man slowly preparing himself for the possibility of losing her. And she, though she hadn't said it out loud, was quietly beginning to prepare for that too. After lunch, Diep gathered the empty bowls and carried them to the sink. The sound of running water filled the small kitchen, blending softly with Nee's steady breathing from the other room. The little girl had fallen asleep quickly, her tiny body curled under a worn blanket. Diep stood there for a moment, hands resting in the cool water, listening. Silence. A rare kind of silence. She drained the basin and refilled it to soak vegetables for pickling. The routine movements, washing, trimming, rinsing again, felt almost meditative. There was comfort in repetition, in tasks that made sense. Outside, the wind brushed against the wooden walls, slipping through narrow gaps. The faint smell of burning firewood lingered in the air. Winter hadn't fully let go yet. Diep wiped her hands on her apron and walked quietly into the bedroom. Nee was sleeping peacefully, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, lips slightly parted. Diep's expression softened. She reached down and gently brushed a strand of hair from Nee's forehead. The child didn't stir. Everything depended on her. The timber yard, the workers, the year-end payments, Tet preparations, Nye's school, Nye's meals, Nye's warmth, and somewhere beneath all of that, James. She thought about the piles of wood still waiting at the yard, the phone calls she hadn't returned yet, the surprise she had planned for the workers. Each responsibility felt like another weight tied to her shoulders. How long could she keep this up? The question flickered briefly across her mind, but she didn't allow it to stay. She sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. In moments like this, quiet, simple, she felt her strength returning. Not because things were easier, but because she had no choice. She stood again and returned to the kitchen. Even if James drifted further away, even if the yard closed after Tet, she would hold on to what she could control. As evening deepened and the sky turned a muted grey, her phone buzzed in her pocket. James. She answered without greeting. "I found a buyer who wants 60 more tons of firewood," he said. "Should we move forward?" Diep stepped outside, her eyes traveling up the tall stacks of wood in the yard. The cold air bit at her cheeks. Her body felt tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "After Tet," she replied firmly. There was a pause on the other end. "We could secure it now," James added. "After Tet," she repeated, her voice steady. The call ended shortly after. No argument, no discussion, just distance. Diep remained standing in the yard long after the line went silent. The sky was darkening fast, the horizon swallowed by night. The wood piles cast long, heavy shadows. The feeling creeping into her chest wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something quieter, like the final drop of water in an already full cup. James still called. He still talked business. But he never asked about Nee. He never asked if she had eaten. He never asked if she was tired. The fragile thread connecting them felt thinner than ever. Maybe he was slowly preparing himself for the idea of losing her. And maybe she was beginning to accept that too. The wind cut across the yard again, sharp and cold. Tet would arrive no matter what. Work wouldn't stop. And her heart, no matter how worn, would keep moving forward. She turned and walked back toward the house, the light from inside faint but steady. Inside, Nee slept. Inside, there was still warmth. Later that evening, Diep stepped next door and asked her neighbor to listen for Nye while she went out briefly. "I'll be quick," she said. She climbed onto her motorbike and started the engine. The cold wind struck her face as she rode through the quiet village road, but she didn't slow down. In her pocket was something small, almost insignificant to anyone else. A packet of vegetable seeds. At Miss Tui's house, the older woman handed her the reserved order. Red beets, radishes, carrots, cucumbers, melons, sweet pumpkin leaves, Miss Tui listed. You asked me to keep them. Diep nodded. She had placed the order weeks ago, thinking ahead to after Tet. 100,000, Miss Tui said. Diep paid and tucked the seeds safely into her jacket. A small, genuine smile appeared on her face, one that felt different from the forced smiles she wore during the day. On the ride home, the sky burned in shades of deep red and fading orange. The last light of the old year seemed to stretch across the horizon. She imagined pressing the seeds into soil once Tet passed. Imagined tiny green shoots breaking through cold earth. Life had a way of returning, even after winter, even after distance, even after love began to change. The motorbike hummed steadily beneath her as she rode along the familiar road. The fields on both sides were quiet, waiting. For once, her phone wasn't ringing. There were no chainsaws, no negotiations, just wind, just breath, just the sound of the engine. When she reached home, she paused at the gate for a moment. The house looked small under the fading sky, simple, worn, but it was hers. Inside was Nai. Inside was purpose. Inside was something she could still protect. Diep touched the pocket where the seeds rested. After Tet, she would plant them. After Tet, something new would grow. Even if James moved further away, even if life remained heavy, she would choose hope. Not the loud kind, just the quiet kind that lives in small decisions. She opened the door gently and stepped inside. The cold wind stayed outside, and in the dim warmth of her home, Diep prepared herself to face another day.